What I'm talking about today is an idea for exploratory diagnostics to look into irregular clusters, clusters that have some kind of internal structuring in more detail. And this is actually an idea that's a byproduct of a paper that I published recently in a slightly different context. So what do I mean? If we look at data sets like this one, for example, which is a population grid from the city of Dortmund, then we can easily spot clusters. Of course, we immediately see that there's lots of population in the city center. We can see local pockets of clustering in the suburbs. But we can also guess that these clusters are not entirely homogeneous, right? So they have some internal structuring. It's not so easy in this combined map, but there's some internal irregularities here. And one thing we can do is we can use Moran eigenvector filtering to split up the variation contained in this data in different parts, for example, into positive autocorrelation, negative spatial autocorrelation, and random variation. And the traditional way to use this method, Moran eigenvector filtering, has been to get rid of space, so to filter spatial effects out in order to use spatial data, for example, in regression contexts, and to make sure that the spatial data does not violate assumptions of regression analysis, non-spatial regression analysis, of course. But the way I'm using Moran eigenvector filtering here is slightly different, because I do not want to control for positive and negative spatial autocorrelation in order to get rid of it. But instead, what I have proposed in the paper that I mentioned in the beginning is to use the eigenvectors in slightly different ways. So for example, controlling for negative spatial autocorrelation and spatial randomness in order to maximize the positive spatial autocorrelation to obtain something like a smooth version of the clustering in the data set. And we can do exactly the same thing also in the opposite direction. We can also say we control for positive spatial autocorrelation and spatial randomness by using respective eigenvectors associated with these types of clusters or types of patterns in the data in order to maximize the negative spatial autocorrelation, or in other words, the fluctuations, kind of the spatially structured fluctuations that are in data. I use these two different filtered data sets in the remainder of this talk. So a smooth version of the spatial clustering in order to have the spatial clusters available, but also the spatially structured systematic fluctuations which may account for interesting structure within the clusters. Randomness is less interesting because randomness doesn't give us so much of a clue of what's actually happening. So these two filtered versions of a data set I combine with two measures here. One is a fairly standard measure of clustering, GI star, in order to get or to find out where significant clusters are located, and also LOSH, which is a more recent measure of heteroscedasticity, spatial variance, spatially structured variance in a sense. And just when I was listening to Nick's talk, I thought, well, maybe it would also be interesting to use ELSA in this context instead of LOSH, for example, to look into heterogeneities. So these two applied not to raw data, but to these two filtered data sets or filtered versions of a data set. This is the paper I was talking about. So if you want to look into more details, I invite you to check out this very recent Environmental Planning B paper. You see the original context was geosocial media, and I focused on the positive autocorrelation part in that paper. But I figured out it's also interesting to use the same kind of methodology to look into diverse clusters or irregular clusters. In this context, I have used a different data set. The data set I have used here is actually a very interesting one. It's called EFDI, E-Food Desert Index, which is a recent data set provided by Andy Newing and colleagues from Leeds, and available through CDRC data portal. And this is a compound variable or compound indicator combining traditional dimensions of food deserts with more recent ones like propensity to shop online, accessibility of online groceries, and so on and so forth. So kind of a more modern version of a food desert index. And I have investigated it for West Midlands. And if we just apply a GI star to get a quick overview of where clusters are, we see that food deserts in this region are mostly located in the urban centers, which are quite deprived: Birmingham, Walsall, Wolverhampton. Surprisingly, not so much in Coventry, where I've been living for a while. But we can see that the more affluent rural parts here really are better off and are cold spots. So applying the method that I briefly introduced in the beginning to look into these clusters in more detail, what we get is, I hope it comes up. Yeah, there we are. What we get is this kind of map with 3 different colors. So blue means the 2 measures, LOSH and GI star, apply to the positively filtered data, green the negative one, and pink indicates areas where the results were significant for both of them. Blue is not so interesting here. Blue is interesting because blue indicates variations in the intensity of spatial associations. It's also interesting to figure out why some clusters are blue and why some are not. But I don't have much time, so I will focus on the other 2 because I think they're more interesting. So looking into, for example, the pink ones, where we find clusters to be heterogeneous in both filtered versions, negative and positive spatial autocorrelation, clustering and fluctuations. This is interesting because it oftentimes indicates areas where there are disruptions. So for example, if you look into if you look at the central pink one near the label for Birmingham, this is actually the site of a Jaguar assembly plant and a school. So kind of a disruption of the pattern. Something that might be interesting to bear in mind when focusing on the spatial analysis of this data set, right? Because this is something that doesn't really belong to EFDI. It is an external disruption. So these are non-spatial things we can detect. And this is also something I found in the journal paper, where you can see this in more detail for a different data set. I want to focus on the green one now, Marston Green, north of Birmingham International Airport. Green means that the already heterogeneous fluctuation is heterogeneous in itself. So if you think of this EFDI data set, this is a compound data set. It combines lots of different dimensions. And what is interesting is that this green area is associated with a very heterogeneous IMD, index of multiple deprivation, which is one dimension of the EFDI data set. So this is something that is not so visible in the EFDI data set because it's a compound one. It combines lots of dimensions. But it's interesting that, combining these steps that I initially presented, it is possible to look into or to kind of recover these different dimensions that have fed into the compound data set. I think. And so the message is you can use these diagnostics in order to look into possible problems that may interfere with a spatial analysis. If you're not aware of these things, for example, in this compound data set, then you might misinterpret spatial analysis because you don't know where the variation or the fluctuation is coming from. So it's a diagnostics that requires you to look at, hints you on interesting regions, but to look into these regions in more detail and in different ways. And of course, I didn't talk about the positive autocorrelation here. So only little time to talk about this, but some contributions that I want to mention here. So first of all, I think this is an interesting way, an additional diagnostics for the toolbox to look into clusters and characterize them and how they are internally structured or how they are internally diverse. It could be an interesting diagnostics for compounds, but not only, also for others. For example, think of rates with varying base populations and therefore lots of heteroscedasticity. Could also be interesting to look into rate variables. And a last point to mention is that, of course, the interpretation of this is kind of challenging because you need to have some kind of domain knowledge, right? So you have to look, it kind of points you to interesting regions that may be problematic in the spatial analysis. But then, of course, you need to look into these regions in more detail in order to find out, for example, what's going on, like there being a Jaguar assembly plant or something like that, that may disrupt the pattern. And I think I have finished on time, and I'm open to questions.
I will use my chair's privilege and ask a question. It's kind of linked to what you were talking about at the end, like the complexities of interpreting what that heterogeneity means, because it's quite interesting to see. So you've got this indicator of sort of food poverty, essentially. And I would have thought that actually those two indicators that you were comparing it to in the paper, so the IMD and the IUC, would explain quite a lot of variation in there. But I guess, yeah, I wondered if you had any reflections on interpreting the heterogeneity with relation to the food poverty distribution.
I think what the diagnostics actually show and hint on is that there are different scales. I think the variation that you've seen in the IMD is on a different scale than lots of the other dimensions that feed into the compound one, into the compound indicator. So it's probably a way of looking into compound variables like the EFDI in a way to detect different scales that have been combined and can be recovered using these diagnostics. It's interesting that you mentioned the IUC. You might have spotted it on when I left the presenter mode, because I originally wanted to have that on a presentation as well. Yeah, that's also very similar indeed. Yes. So the IUC, Internet User Classification, is also on a similar scale.
Yeah, I think I got it from your write-up actually. Yeah, fantastic, thank you. We've got another question here in the chat. Have you been able to compare it with the CDRC's data on dispersion of shops and shop types?
No, I haven't. Unfortunately not. But what I have done is, if you look into the paper that I mentioned, I have looked into Brazilian census data. So this data set here I have just used in the short paper. I have looked into into a Brazilian census data set in more detail, and there you find lots of interesting interpretations of the things that I briefly mentioned here in this talk. So no, sorry, I really can't say anything about shops and shop types.
I also wondered whether Louise's question from earlier in the first presentation about whether it's going to be available as like a package in R or anything like that.
I have, yeah, code is available indeed. So if you check out the Environment and Planning B paper, I have uploaded the code that I used as a supplementary material, and you're welcome to download it and use it, yes.